handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er, 8 9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I've got some, my life as a radio show host is full of privileges, and today is one such repeating privilege, because I've got Major Josh Mantz with us, retired Army. What a remarkable story, and Josh is the author of Darker Souls, The Beauty of Darker Souls, which can be found on Amazon. He has a website, darkersouls.com. And Josh is here to kind of explain his new work and his constant work, something that I think that we all need to hear, because this guy just won't stop serving other people. So, Major Josh, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Hey, Denise, it's great to be here, and thanks for such a kind introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, look, sometimes there are certain topics that you generally don't want to have to discuss, but on the other hand, what you're doing and your life continuing to serve others is inspirational, and that is probably a word that's been used to describe you more than once, but it's well deserved. So, this spirit of your book is kind of taking, I would say, a life full of trauma and getting beyond that, so you can have a second or third or many more chances at an additional new life. Did I get any of that right?
Oh yeah, the title itself, right? The beauty of a darker soul. It obviously sounds like a paradox, but it kind of is. But the meaning of that title, right, is that even through the worst experiences that we endure throughout our lives, when we can successfully integrate those experiences and learn how to grow from them, it broadens our emotional bandwidth and gives us the capacity to empathize with other people on a much deeper level. And this ability to help impact the lives of other people is really where I find the greatest meaning in life. And that's where I find beauty within the darkness. So I think you really hit a key point there about kind of service to others, and I just think the relationships that we build and share between one another, the power of the human connection that we share, is really one of the most powerful things that we experience in our lives.
Well, certain people out there in the world are good for these kinds of quests, and others perhaps not so much if they don't know what possibilities that they can open up and opportunities that they can open up for somebody else. So I'm feeling here that you were with brothers and sisters in Iraq, and post Iraq, you still are with brothers and sisters. So you've got the past brothers and sisters, you've got those in the present, but you've got a whole new inventory of brothers and sisters, and hence relationships that are still to come, that are undefined to you at this, and to really anybody, correct?
Yeah, one thing about emotional trauma is that it doesn't discriminate. And as important as my military service was, and as vital as that was to my life, and I'm still going to continue to support our military and first responders, continuously. But I've also found that this topic of emotional trauma just transcends every echelon of our country, every facet of our society. It's the foundation of school shootings and bullying. It's the foundation of sexual assault and trauma. The list just goes on and on and on, and it's infused within the greatest challenges that our society is facing today. Addiction and the opioid crisis. So I've also kind of learned that at the root cause of most trauma lies the moral and ethical and spiritual implications that go with them. Things like shame and guilt and powerlessness and betrayal. And when we have the ability to look at it through those lenses, right, to look at our experiences through a much deeper lens, it can really give us the capacity to connect with people that may come from backgrounds that seem completely unlike our own, yet we can find that connection virtually everywhere we look. So it's been a pretty powerful journey to really help people look at this through a much deeper lens, through a much more real and complex lens. And you're right. Like, not everyone can or should be out there, just in the public's eye. I mean, there's a lot of dangers to that, to be honest with you. I mean, it's kind of a very challenging career in a lot of ways. But that's not the point. What can really, not just the book, but just this topic of trauma, if we can help people start conversations, right? Even if it's between their own family members or between their own close circle of friends, that's where progress really is made. That's where human connection is really built. So what we're really trying to do here in that facet is to help people, give them the language to generate some of these deeper conversations that we usually tend to avoid. And that can give us a lot of strength.
Josh, if I was to say that trauma means pain, would that be a very simplified statement?
So let me put it this way. That's a great question. Like, what is emotional trauma? And the way that I define it is that these are experiences that fundamentally alter the way we believe the world should work, right? And when our perception of the world gets flipped upside down, it can really begin to compromise the way that we feel about ourselves. And when we're unable to make sense of these types of experiences, when we're unable to integrate them into our lives, which is a very common challenge, very difficult thing to do, but it can really lead to a profound sense of isolation and a feeling that we don't belong in society, or that no one could possibly understand what we're experiencing. And there's a lot of very serious consequences to that. When we tend to be very good as human beings at burying that emotional pain, at shutting it off, at ignoring it. And the problem is that when we do that, although there's a time and a place to do that, most of us don't know that we're doing it. And what inherently happens is when we suppress that and continue to move forward in our lives without resolving it, it's almost as if we're trying to build a house on a cracked foundation, right? And if we continue to build that house, and if we keep ignoring those cracks and those prior traumatic experiences, we never really know how that's going to impact the structure of the house, what's going to cause it to collapse at some point. And that's kind of the deeper message here is helping people understand the impacts that these types of experiences can have, so that they can validate the source of that emotional pain, and then begin to grow from it.
So you were shot and killed by a sniper in 2007, correct?
That is correct.
And it took you a long time. So you are experienced at the content of this book. In other words, you are experienced in a life-changing event and this process. So are you describing yourself and imparting that wisdom to be perseverance to the adversity? Is that kind of the spirit of where you're wanting to take this reader?
Yeah, the overarching intent of the book is to help people first recognize and then validate the true source of their pain. And yes, I was shot, killed by a sniper, all that stuff, and that's on the surface that sounds extremely traumatic, right? It sounds like the holy grail of trauma.
Well, it is.
Right?
It is.
And that's, but in reality, Denise, like what that really was a distraction from where the true pain really was, and I know that may sound odd, it may sound complex, but let me elaborate on that for a second. Trauma is not always what it seems. And, for instance, like I went into Baghdad, I knew that, something like that could happen. It wasn't that drastically different from what we knew was possible. And there was a lot of things about that experience, with the exception of losing Staff Sergeant Marlon Harper, who was shot by the same bullet that I was, with the exception of losing him. The totality of that experience was actually one of the more powerful experiences in my life, more positive experiences in my life. I got to see a medical team just perform brilliantly in the face of extreme adversity. It was like watching a choreographed dance. They each had their just brilliant performance. I got to see this outcry of support from the community. I got to see my men perform in the face of crisis, just without skipping a beat. And to be able to witness all that was just incredible. And even the transition to the point of from life to death, like literally as I was taking the last breath, that experience, I can only describe that feeling as a feeling of absolute and complete surrender to something much greater than ourselves. And through that came just an overwhelming sense of peace. The most peaceful experience of my life was actually the point of my death. And the thing is, though, that afterwards, right, it took me almost 10 years to really make sense of that. And that 10-year journey afterwards was really where all of the dangers were, very dangerous past. I was not prepared or even aware of the level of guilt that I was experiencing, the level of shame. It was abandonment in relationships. It was divorce. It was financial distress. It was the powerlessness of living with an incurable disease, of Crohn's disease, which I was. So a lot of these, and it was the totality of the experience of the deployment to Baghdad, not just the near-death thing, right? And what I'm getting at here is again, trauma isn't always what it seems. And when we, in order to really identify the root cause of this emotional pain, we've got to be willing to look at it through a much deeper lens and to be very honest with ourselves. There's no need for bravado. And, for anyone listening, like, your pain is as real as and valid as mine, right? It's the world needs all of us to be at our best. And, when it comes to resolving our past experiences, it can be very tricky to uncover and understand how some of those life events really did impact us. So It's not always what it seems to be on the surface.
So what you have just described here, Josh, is kind of a fusion of conditions and how it can affect and effect individuals and how they process it, the honesty with it, the behavior and what you're going to do with it, and developing some kind of perspective to it all. And so if you were to go to anybody who feels like they have some kind of trauma or some kind of pain that is in their life for various reasons, by their own fault or not by their own fault, there's always a way out, and you're telling that story, correct?
That's a great way to put it, Denise. It is, you hit such an important word there, perspective, right? And sometimes, like, this is maybe where the power of human connection comes in more than anywhere else, is the perspective that we can gain from other people in our lives who are close to us. Whether that's a therapist, a friend, a family member, a coworker. That additional perspective can give us the confidence to transcend through these experiences and really eventually become stronger and more powerful because of them, right? I should clarify that, not because of the experience, but because of the journey that we take afterwards in order to integrate.
Journey is a very good word, because you could be social. You can have friendships, you can have a relationship, or you can just have encounters, and all of those have different levels of attributes that you need to necessarily seize on for yourself or for the other person who may be experiencing something that is beyond their capability at the time. So people say, "Oh, I've got friends." Well, I would say there are layers or levels of friendships, and same thing with relationships. So what you're imparting here is connective tissue, whether you come from same backgrounds or different cultures. There's still a connective tissue in some kind of humanity for each other. Okay. Yes.
You are right on. Yep. That's
yay.
Yes, that connected. I really like that. The connective tissue, right, between our experiences is there. The challenge is, how do we access it, right? And how do we have kind of a common language to be able to uncover that and discuss it? And that's really what this book is designed to do. It's not a military book, right? It does use some of my military experience as a vehicle to demonstrate larger points, but it's designed to resonate with really anyone. It's a very universal type of book, and if that can help give us the vernacular, right, give us the vocabulary to start driving these conversations and to uncover where that connective tissue rests, then we've done something right with this book, right? Because it's hard. Trauma is a very complex topic. It's very misunderstood. There's a long way to go, not just within the behavioral health industry, but within society as a whole. Lots of reasons for that, but that is precisely why I'm driven to do the work that I do, is to really change the paradigm in the way that we discuss and think about traumatic experiences.
I don't see, based on what you described here, Josh, I don't see anybody who shouldn't read the book, because, you may not be in any kind of trauma or any kind of pain or any kind of struggle, but you're also necessarily asking the reader to be a little introspective, because they just may be stuck. They may be stuck in a relationship, they may be stuck in a career, they may be stuck with some kind of hidden objective or quest, and your book is giving them a pathway to look inside to say, okay, I can do better, And the beauty of Darker Souls, it doesn't have to be dark, but if you're stuck, you can be dark, that you want to be better for the world. So I don't think anybody's exempt from being a reader of your book.
I really appreciate that, and that's you're correct. It's none of us are exempt from trauma. It definitely does not discriminate, and I do think, and especially based on the feedback we've gotten since the book has released, really from every walk of life, this book is connecting with people from every different background in their own ways, right? And that's, if I had to give any bit of advice before approaching the book, it would be to look at it through your own lens, right? Look for the deeper messaging within it and how it may apply to your life. And it could really empower readers to not only validate the journey that they've been through up to this point, but to also validate their experiences, that they are real.
Yes.
And that's important. It's, again, I mean, I can't say this enough. We as human beings have a very natural tendency to compare ourselves to other people.
Yes.
Right. And when we do that, especially when we do that when we're talking about trauma, we tend to minimize ourselves when we do that. It's like saying, well, I haven't been through anything like what you've been through. And the moment we say that, we're essentially minimizing ourselves. And I get the point of being humble, and I respect humility more than anything else. But it's really important to try to avoid that when it comes to developing your own inner strength. And the point of this is that again, it's not about the big flashy traumatic experiences that we might think are so extreme on the surface. To me, getting shot was the easy part, and it was the 10-year journey afterwards that was the hard part.
Indeed. So
and that's not to minimize, like, for somebody else, getting shot might have been the hard part,
Right,
but it's
right.
the point is, it's all relative, right? And it's this book, the experience, the work that I do, is designed to help people, like, really connect with themselves, and then ultimately, like, empower them to connect with others doing the same.
Well, I am very humbled here to be in your presence, and I would suggest, because I see parents and I see teachers, I see people of all kinds of disciplines that need to read your book and plant some seeds early on, and apply some of those honesties that I think you're imparting in your book. So I think we're grateful. You've probably done a public service here that is larger than you'll likely ever know, because you don't necessarily know who's reading it out there and getting some real boost of your work and your words. So Major Josh Mantz, thank you for being with us here. And ladies and gentlemen, please go over to darkersouls.com. I think you have a Facebook page, do you not?
We do. That's usually so some exciting stuff here. I'm actually going through a major revamp of the website and everything to kind of take this company to the next level. So if you're able to follow Darker Souls LLC Facebook page, that's a great way to keep in touch. And just know that there's going to be a lot more to come here in the coming months. The end of summer, we're going to launch some new stuff.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Josh, Major Josh. Thank you, and I hope we talk again very soon.
Oh, thank you, Denise. It was great being on your show.
Thank you.
All the best.
All right, more coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you this 24/7 stream of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. We are a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. If you're able, please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. Your donation will go a long way in helping us continue to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Hi, this is Captain Matt Bruce from the Captain's America Third Watch, and you're listening to Talk America Radio, the new dominant force in conservative talk radio.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia.
And Don Newen from Cowboy Logic Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't go to sleep every night completely fatigued from trying to restore America from the destruction that is taking place,
then you're simply not doing enough. Join us every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, for Cowboy Logic Radio.
let the restoration begin.
Donald Trump came to Washington vowing to drain the swamp and make government work for the American people. But the swamp creatures in D.C. aren't going down without a fight, and the deep state is determined to overturn the election and keep their gravy train rolling. In these turbulent times, it's critical for patriots to stay engaged and be prepared to defend this president. You can stay up to date on Trump's battle to make America great again by listening to America First Radio with Jim Dawes each weeknight at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Liberty Feed.
Hi, it's Mark Walters from Armed American Radio. You know, for nearly a decade, I've been educating, informing, and entertaining responsibly armed Americans. And during that time together, we've shared some ups and downs, haven't we? Trump's election saved our Supreme Court and no doubt the future of our gun rights for now. But now is not the time to lay down. The enemies of freedom are well-funded and more determined than ever. To keep up with the state of your gun rights, make sure to tune in to Armed American Radio right here on Talk America Radio, the new dominant voice in conservative talk radio.
This is Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience. When I'm not debating with Donna Fiducia about politics, I listen to Cowboy Logic Radio. Why, you ask? Because outside of my blog, founderscode.com, and my own radio show, the Denise Simon Experience, Cowboy Logic is by far the most entertaining and informative radio show on planet Earth. Plus, Don makes me feel guilty if I don't listen to his radio show every week.
You cannot retreat to your safe spaces. There are no therapy poodles allowed, especially when facing the truth. And that's just how we like it. Straight, hard, conservatarian talk, on the rocks, no chaser. Served up on the Adrian Slade Show. Small, limited government, constitutional conversations, exclusively on Talk America Radio. Every Saturday morning, 9 a.m. on Talk America Radio Liberty.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia. And WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. You know, I got the distinct privilege of having a professor with us, Lawrence Abel, who is a professor emeritus at Wayne State University. I happen to date a guy who graduated from Wayne State a long time ago, by the way. He is a very successful author of countless books and a speaker, and I would say one of the better historians that we have out there. And so we're going to discuss his newest book, on John Wilkes Booth. But the cool thing is about John Wilkes Booth and what the professor has provided to us are all the women that loved him. So thank you, Professor Abel, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Let me start off with, I'm going to kind of, the publisher sends me questions and I generally don't like them. So I go another direction.
Okay.
But let me start off with this one. I would say, who was Isabel Sumner?
Isabel Sumner was a young girl around 16 years of age who became involved with John Wilkes Booth when he was in Boston. And he wrote her letters. She wrote back to him. She kept his letters. He didn't keep hers. And it's one of the few instances that we have several letters from John Wilkes Booth to a woman. You might say he fell in love with her, and he kept writing to her and telling her how deeply he felt for her, and wanted her, to feel the same way about him. And finally, he convinces her. Now she's a teenager, and she's living home with her parents. He convinces her to come to New York on her own to see him. And she does. But when she gets there, he is ill, and he writes to her, "I'm too sick to see you." And she says, "Well, I'll come and see you." But he's cooled by now, because one thing John Wilkes Booth was guilty of, if you want to put it that way, is commitment. And he did not want to get involved with anybody because of just the kind of nature he was. And he tells her not to come and visit. And while she's there all by herself, what is she going to do? She decides to go home. And she never hears from him again, but she keeps his letters. And they're discovered many, many years later by her daughter, and they finally get published in a little book, and so now we have them, and we know about their short romance.
I was going to ask you, Professor, your book's got about 100 pages of notes and citations and bibliography. So in order to write this, you really went the whole spectrum from state to state to state to uncover evidence, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I delved into historical newspapers, historical libraries, government archives, old letters, went as many places I thought they might have some information about these women, and I'm sure there's much more that I missed, but I try to be thorough.
Yes, you do indeed. Now, another fascinating part of this book is we have this gypsy woman. And for some reason, John Wilkes Booth decided that he was going to have his palm read. And, normally they just kind of take your money and they just kind of tell you something and go on. But in this particular case, this gypsy must have had some talent. Would you say that she was rather spot on with her assessment of who John Wilkes Booth was?
Yes and no. Now, this is the interesting thing about that whole story. It seems too accurate to actually been true. And my belief, even though I cite it as one of the anecdotes, it's cited by his sister Asia. And I have a feeling, and I can't verify this or can't,
You can't call anybody and ask them.
She may have, fabricated this story in a way that justifies his actions. Now, here's a brother that she loves dearly, and she has to explain somehow why he goes and kills the President of the United States. And what she sort of comes up with was it's foreordained. It was in the stars. And this is the whole idea of the gypsy fortune. So, yes, this is an anecdote that's come into history. I cite it early on in the book because it's a very interesting anecdote. I can't prove it or disprove it, but the back of my mind thinks that maybe she sort of fabricated a little of it, if not a lot.
Okay, but you didn't expect to find that in your research, did you?
Oh, the gypsy prophecy is well known. That one I knew a lot about.
Oh, all right.
Most historians who have written about that have cited that. It's just a question of whether or not how much you believe that.
Well, I must have missed that in the history lesson because I don't think I remember any part of a palm reading on John Wilkes Booth. So glad you certainly included that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this cat, he came from a very large family, but it appears that he was probably the favorite of the children.
Oh, yeah. He came from a very, very dysfunctional family. He was the ninth of 10 children. And that was, his family was very, very dysfunctional. There's a famous saying that all happy families are happy in the same way, and all unhappy families are unhappy in each their own way. And all of the Booth children were unhappy in their own way. It started with his father, even up before the children. The father, when he was 13, was sued for paternity back in England. He was born in England in 1796, and when he's 13 years old, he's in court with his own father being sued for paternity. At 16, he's back in court for the same reason. When the father becomes an actor, he goes to Belgium with his acting group, and he seduces a girl in Belgium, and when she becomes pregnant, they elope to England, and he marries her. And then at 24, he seduces another girl, an 18-year-old girl. He abandons his own wife and his year-old son, and then he elopes to pregnant with his new love, who is eventually going to become John's mom.
Bizarre.
Then you have a whole bunch of other of his children. His oldest brother, Junius Brutus Jr., does pretty much the same thing. He gets married, he has a child, he abandons his wife, runs off with another woman, and then after she dies, he eventually marries a third woman who is younger than his daughter. And it goes on and on.
But this is what's kind of fascinating, because we have to kind of go back in space and time. And that was a terribly scandalous thing to be doing back then. I mean, it was kind of like, the remnants of the old Scarlet Letter kind of deal. I mean, you were really societally shunned, but maybe not so much, right?
Oh, very much so. It was very scandalous. And remember, he's committing adultery, which is one of the gravest sins in the Victorian lifestyle. So had anybody found out about this, his career would have been torpedoed. And so what he does in order not to be found out, he rents a cabin in a remote part of Maryland, distant from Baltimore, so that no one's going to be coming across him and his family. So he's very aware of what the scandal would do to his career.
And staying with space and time, we tend to forget that whole space and time, an awful lot was going on in the country. I mean, we were at war, and yet there was a society kind of that was expanding and, doing its thing. So there were an awful lot of intersections with society and politics and all kinds of things, communications and letters and newspapers. And so for John Wilkes Booth, it's almost like he tried to be part of everything, but yet part of something else. He kind of, in his younger days, didn't know really what he wanted to be. Correct?
Well, no. He always knew he wanted to be an actor. His whole family were actors. His brothers, anyways. And his father was, his father who I just talked about was the most famous Shakespearean actor of his day. Mm-hmm. His older brother became an actor. His next older brother became an actor, and he was an actor himself. So he knew what he wanted to be. He wanted to be an actor, and one of the reasons he wanted to be an actor, he was so enamored with the theater, but he wanted fame. He needed fame.
All right. So, but he necessarily got sometimes tired with the theater and wanted to, try something else, but the theater kept drawing him back, correct?
Correct. Well, yes, it was a tiring type of work for an actor, especially a star. Stars, they had to travel a lot. They would go to one place for a week. They'd be in 4 or 5 shows, and then they'd travel next week to another place and another place. And this was going on every week, except for the summer months when it was too hot to be in the theater. And it was exhausting work. So he gets tired of it at one time, and he wants to branch out. He liked money. He was very avaricious for money, and he starts investing in property. And he buys up some land in Boston. He buys up some lots in oil wells in Pennsylvania. And he tries to have a separate source of income so that he can get out of acting if he ever wants to.
But through all of this, he was very, very loyal to the South. How did that really happen? Where did this loyalty come from?
Well, it came from growing up in Maryland. Maryland was a divided state, half pro-Southern, half pro-Union. The area that he grew up in, the Baltimore area, was very pro-Southern. So the people that he lived with, surrounded himself with, were all pretty much Southern in their attitudes. They had slaves. His friends were all pro-Southern. So he grows up with that culture. And when he goes to Richmond for a couple of years, and he's surrounded by Southern culture. So he imbibes this, and he becomes very much Southern in his outlook.
So in all this travel, Professor, he's meeting women all along the way, and women are meeting him. Yes. And, he's got quite the inventory, and I would say getting quite the reputation, right?
He must have known several hundred women. I was only able to identify specifically 14 that I had detailed information about. But we have little glimpses of him having little affairs without the women being named.
Busy man. busy man.
Oh, I like to call him the horizontal man.
Oh, all right. Well, that works, Professor. Now, at what point did he develop this hatred, this disdain for Abraham Lincoln? I mean, it seemed like this was something that had, gotten into, a bad seed that was planted inside him, and it festered, and it seemed to fester for quite some time, correct?
Yes, it did. But he wasn't the only one who hated Lincoln. Lincoln had a desk full of death threats. He wasn't the popular president that we know today. In his own day, he was very much disliked by a large proportion of the population, not just in the South, but also in the North. And in his early years, John Wilkes Booth hated him for the same reason a lot of other Northerners hated him. Lincoln passes a number of measures that are very unconstitutional. He suspends the writ of habeas corpus, which means that you can arrest somebody, but you have to bring them in front of a court to, hear the charges. He passes he issues this Emancipation Proclamation, which, we think of today as something very immoral. But in those days, people were still very much opposed to fighting a war to free slaves. They were fighting in the North to keep the Union intact. So that was very unfortunate. He also institutes a draft for the first time in the North, and that creates riots in New York, and people are killed. He passes an income tax. He does a lot of things that doesn't make him a very favorable person in a lot of people's eyes. And John Wilkes Booth, sort of festers and is obsessed with all these things that Lincoln is doing, and especially he sees him trying to destroy the South that he loves. And so it just keeps building and building and building, this hatred. When he starts to do something about it is a different story. That takes the story in a different tact.
Yeah, at one point he was actually he was going to kidnap Lincoln, correct?
Yes, he was. In August of 1864, he has this. He changes. His personality changes terrifically. Before, he was a very well-liked guy. He had a lot of friends. People, both of sexes, male and female, were his friends. They all loved him. He was a very kind and generous person. But in August 1864, Dr. Jekyll becomes Mr. Hyde. And he starts doing things that are completely different from the way he used to be. And he decides he's going to take it on himself to kidnap Lincoln and take him off to Richmond and have the government trade him for the release of POWs in the Union jails. But that falls through, after a number of silly attempts and silly plans. And at the last minute, after General Lee surrenders, he decides there's one last thing he can do. He's going to kill Lincoln, and he believes that God has sent him to do this.
Professor, John Wilkes Booth seemed to be conflicted from early on in his life. I mean, mostly, he has a family problem, then he has a woman problem, and then he has a political problem, and then he has, I guess, some kind of a, what am I going to do with the rest of my life kind of problem? Because, he loved the theater, he loved the fame, but it was wearing and tearing on him. So it's kind of like, this is a guy that was just always conflicted, and his fame was that he was going to, and did, kill Lincoln such that he would have the ultimate fame. Did I kind of say that right?
You did. You put your finger right on it. This is why he's such an interesting guy, because he has these inner conflicts. It's, if he was just a terrible guy to begin with, wouldn't be as interesting. But he has all these inner conflicts, and that's what makes him an interesting character, and that's why so many people keep, researching John Wilkes Booth, because he isn't a simple guy at all. He's a complex guy, and he has a variety of motives, and they keep changing.
Well, I would also say, too, with at least over, a dozen, maybe 2 dozen, 3 dozen, we may never know, of women that were just fawning at him all the time, that gave him a sense of invincibility, didn't it?
Well, I don't know if that gave him a sense of invisibility. It gave him it boosted his ego. He thought that, he had all this, women fawning over him. That maybe he not invisible, but whatever he does, he's still going to be loved.
I mean, it stroked his ego such that he felt that he could, he could achieve really just about anything, and that he wanted to do something really profound. But then he encounters Lucy Lambert Hale. Tell us about Lucy.
Well, Lucy is the daughter of a United States Senator from New Hampshire, John P. Hale. And the Hale family are abolitionists, and John Wilkes Booth is a racist. So you wouldn't think they'd get along very well. Also, John Wilkes Booth is a really handsome Adonis-type guy, and Lucy is a plain Jane. She's not a very attractive woman, so you look at her picture, and you wonder, he has his pick of all the women you could probably want on the stage. Some of them, the most beautiful women on the American stage, and he's getting engaged to Lucy. What's behind all this? Well, Lucy, when she was younger, had a lot of men attracted to her. I don't know really what she looked like. She's said to have been beautiful, but if you look at her pictures, she's very matronly. So I don't know if she put a lot of weight on since the young guys were chasing her. And by the way, some of the men who were chasing her became very distinguished. Oliver Wendell Holmes was one of her boyfriends.
Interesting.
William Chandler, Secretary of the Navy, who she eventually married many years later, after Booth is killed, was also writing her love poem. So she had some kind of charm about her that attracted men to her. Maybe that's part of what happened. They lived in the same hotel, the National Hotel, so they came across one another on frequent occasions. But one of the things that attracted John Wilkes Booth to Lucy, I believe, was her respectability. John, remember I told you that his father had abandoned his wife, his first wife, and run off to America with his second wife. He kept the first wife in the dark for a long time, but she eventually finds out that he's got this other woman and he's got these children, and he's been lying to her all this time. So she decides to come to the United States and expose him, and she does, and she finds where he's living, and she goes to farms where they're selling their produce, where the wife is selling her produce, and she's screaming at her and calling her a whore, and the children are all bastards, and totally humiliated the family. Now the kids take this, and they're very much ashamed. And what happens is, in my mind at least, is that they react in different ways. And one of the ways that they react is try to gain respectability. And that's very important for all the family, and especially John, who sees marrying a U.S. Senator's daughter a way to achieve respectability. This is the ultimate kind of respectability you can get. You're going to be a son-in-law of a U.S. U.S. Senator. So this is one of the reasons I think he gets engaged to her.
And was her picture one of the pictures that was found on his body after he was shot?
Yes, there were 5 photos. This is what makes this guy such an unusual guy, fellow. He has these 5 photos on his body when he's finally killed. One of them is Lucy, and the other are 4 actresses that he was involved with. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of guy keeps a picture of his fiancée and 4 other women in his pocket? You wouldn't think that he would, somebody who's committed to a woman he's about to be married would have pictures of other women. So this is one of the intriguing, and this is actually what set me off on writing this book, because I wondered, what kind of guy does this kind of thing, and who are these women? And I had not been able to find out much about them other than their names. So I started digging and finding out who they were and what their lives were and what happened to them after Booth got assassinated. And that took me to not only to them, but to the other women in his life. And eventually, I started tracking these women down, as I said, and the book is my cold case studies.
Well, congratulations, because your book ends up being, I would say, should be almost a historical textbook into itself. You've done academia a real public service here, and so we thank you for that. We've been speaking with Professor Lawrence Abel, a professor emeritus at Wayne State University. He's written several books and is certainly a speaker. And congratulations on John Wilkes Booth and the women who loved him. It's a fun read, and we appreciate the boundless energy that you applied to this, because it had to be really a work of love of history and kind of its own challenge. So, Professor, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience, and best of luck with the book.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, more coming your way, so stay with us.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie 435 9er 21. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie 47 tree 9er 89er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds AGPT. Cast
ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Congressional Review Act. I think we've discussed that a couple of times here on the Denise Simon Experience, but Pacific Legal Foundation's with us. So happy they are. Jonathan Wood decided to be the victim here on the Denise Simon Experience, so we can talk about this Congressional Review Act. First question, thank you for Jonathan for being with us, but first question is the entire concept, the entire regulatory thing called the Congressional Review Act law, is it working?
Well, first, thank you for having me, Denise. It's always a pleasure. The Congressional Review Act has been working in part. It was responsible for the disapproval of 15 rules last year, which have been the signature legislative accomplishment of the Trump administration, or at least one of the biggest accomplishments. So I think the Congressional Review Act has done a lot of work recently. But the point PLF has been trying to explain for the past year is that there's a lot more work to be done. For decades, agencies have ignored their obligation to send rules to Congress for review before they go into effect, which means all of those rules still have to be sent up, and Congress still has an opportunity to consider where they're the best rules that should be in place. The idea behind the Congressional Review Act is simple. When unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats want to impose rules on you, me, or any other American, they first have to subject those rules to scrutiny by our elected representatives. It is a very small amount of a small effort to restore democratic accountability to the administrative state, but it's an important one, and it is patently unlawful for agencies to ignore their obligations to subject their work to Congress.
For a little context, Mr. Jonathan, I would say the Congressional Review Act, if I'm not mistaken, was signed into law during the Bill Clinton administration. Is that right?
That's right. And it was actually sponsored by Harry Reid. This is a key bipartisan statute. Everyone's for democratic accountability, except it turns out unelected bureaucrats at agencies.
And we really didn't know too much about the process and the use and application of the Congressional Review Act until, I would say, in earnest, Trump came into office, because a lot of outside firms, much like Pacific Legal and the American Enterprise Institute, whatnot, had decided, and Heritage, have decided that we are going to use this to examine, and they actually invited industry leaders to look at these cockamamie regulatory conditions that were put in place in the last 8 to 10 years, be examined, and some of them have actually been pretty good. Didn't Trump even actually sign something that said if you want to add one relation, you got to take out 2, and I think it ended up being taking out 6. Did I get that right?
I believe it is a 2-for-1. Every new rule an agency wants to enact, it has to propose repealing 2 rules that cost at least as much as the new rule. And the Congressional Review Act provides an excellent mechanism for agencies to comply with that executive order. You're right that the statute didn't get a lot of attention before last year. Before that, it had only been used once to block a regulation. And the reason for that is simple. Before now, we haven't had a Congress and a president all that interested in deregulation. Mm-hmm. And that's ultimately what the Congressional Review Act is about. It's about taking power back from administrative agencies and giving it back to our elected representatives in Congress.
Sounds like almost a Herculean task. But here comes Pacific Legal. Now, why does your law firm care about some of these, regulations and being in this regulatory state? How did this end up being in your sandbox?
Well, PLF is committed to taking on the unconstitutional regulatory state. Many of our cases have a common theme. Some unelected, unaccountable bureaucrat does something that harms and violates the rights of ordinary Americans. That's really the prototypical PLF case, and we've been practicing those kinds of cases for decades. But we recognize that it takes a concerted effort. You have to develop themes and develop theories that can deal with more than just one-off cases. It's not one bad bureaucrat making a bad decision. This is an endemic problem, and the Congressional Review Act is a perfect example of that. It is very easy for agencies to comply with the statute. All they have to do is send their rules to Congress, but they can't even comply with that minimal amount of democratic scrutiny over their work.
And I would say because of the history and the cases that PLF handles, a lot of it comes out of the EPA side, correct?
Well, so I think we have filed 2 lawsuits this week challenging the Department of Interior's failure to submit the 2 different rules. EPA has been somewhat better than average. I think we found a few rules that they haven't submitted, but it varies a ton by agencies, and this is not limited to one agency.
Right. Okay.
Most agencies have some sort of problem, whether it's they fail to send guidance documents or some other type of rule to Congress. No agency has a 100% compliance rate. They all are vulnerable.
And so if the Congressional Review Act is not adhered to the letter of the law within the agencies, whether it be EPA or Interior or Agriculture or any of the others for that matter, is it the secretary of that agency that is ultimately on the line for those violations, or does it kind of just get passed down to the internal agency bureaucrats?
Well, ultimately, responsibility lies with the president. The Constitution says he's in charge of the executive branch, and so the failure ultimately lands there. And today, President Trump could absolutely cure this problem. All he would have to do is tell the agencies to review their past compliance and start sending up rules they hadn't submitted. But rather than waiting for that, PLF is trying to move the ball forward through the courts. And we filed 2 cases yesterday demanding that unsubmitted rules be submitted to Congress.
And 2 of these cases are conditions that PLF is dealing with. One is, I think, what is it, the Tugal Ranches versus the Department of Interior?
That's right. The 2 cases demonstrate the full scope of the problem. They're very different. The first case is a big, burdensome, controversial rule that the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture did not submit to Congress. It's the sage-grouse land use plans that have locked up tens of millions of acres throughout the West. Despite the fact that rule has resulted in several lawsuits, Congress has held several hearings, and even the Department of Interior has expressed skepticism that it's the best policy, the agencies have refused to send that rule to Congress so that our elected representatives can consider it, and it's exactly the type of big, burdensome rule that Congress wished to subject to political accountability and likely would seriously consider disallowing it through the Congressional Review Act. The other case is the complete opposite side of the problem. What happens when an agency doesn't submit a good rule to Congress in the Congressional Review Act? Representing the Kansas Natural Resources Coalition, we've challenged the failure to submit a rule that actually encourages state and private parties to work together on conserving species to avoid the need to list them under the Endangered Species Act. That rule has been critical to protecting quite a few species, including the lesser prairie chicken, which is really important in the area of Kansas where our client comes from. But although the rule puts property owners and states in this position of having to prove that their conservation efforts will certainly protect the species, the agency's failure to submit the rule to Congress means that it cannot be lawfully in effect, and it undermines the incentives necessary to show that uncertainty. So they're essentially putting our clients in this catch-22 where they have to subject and put a ton of resources into these conservation efforts, while the agency itself, by failing to follow the law, is undermining those very efforts.
Now, Jonathan, you said there are some congressional hearings on this. I'm probably guessing, and I generally watch a lot of them, but I'm probably guessing not a lot of people in Congress on the respective committees, oversight committees, even showed up, because if they want to protect one thing or are being called on the carpet for something else, there's really generally not a consequence or a punishment. There's a recommendation that something needs to happen within 30 or 45 days, whatever the case may be. So in these hearings, really nothing of consequence comes out of them, do they?
Well, in the case of the sage grouse, yes. a few years ago, the House actually passed a resolution to void the rule. It didn't make it through the Senate at the time. But the conflict over the sage-grouse rule in particular has been very heated, and I think it's, you can never fully predict what Congress might do, but it's exactly the sort of rule that Congress and the President might disallow if given the opportunity to review it under the Congressional Review Act.
So when this happens, does Pacific Legal submit something, to the panels or to those in Congress that says, this is hurting, the livelihoods of landowners and whatnot? I mean, do you get to almost do kind of the friends of the court kind of submission?
Well, the hearing on the sage-grouse was before PLF got involved in this litigation.
Okay.
But one of our leaders at PLF actually testified in a hearing last year in the Senate on agencies' failure to comply with the Congressional Review Act, and there the senators were livid about the fact that they were being denied their rights under this statute, and that agencies were insulating their work from political accountability. This is an issue that you should care about regardless of whether you like or dislike a particular rule. It's a problem that exists across the government agencies, and it's not only a problem of agencies enforcing bad rules on people without political oversight, it's a problem of agencies undermining important and beneficial rules because they're not lawfully in effect due to this legal failure.
So when these rules happen, does anybody within those agencies, these bureaucrats, do they do some kind of a study internally, or third party, ask for a study on what the implications are of these regulations and rules?
Under a different statute, most agencies, when they issue rules, have to do some sort of cost-benefit analysis. It's usually, the detail in those can vary, but obviously when an agency is judging its own work, it tends to conclude that its rule is the bee's knees. It's going to have tons of benefits and almost no cost. And there have been lots of skeptics and criticisms of that approach. You wouldn't let an employee review themselves and that be the end of it. You need some additional follow-up and scrutiny, and unfortunately that doesn't exist in the current process. But the way to provide that scrutiny is through the Congressional Review Act. When an agency submits its rule and its cost-benefit analysis, our congressmen and senators should be able to go back and say, wait, how did you get to this? How can the benefits be this high? How can the cost be this low? And if they think the rule is a bad rule, they should be able to disapprove it.
Interesting. And so you have filed 2 lawsuits. Is this go to something like in federal court in Washington?
So yes, both cases have been filed in federal court, though not in D.C. One has been filed in Idaho because that's where our client who's affected by the sage-grouse rule, that's where his ranch is. The other case has been filed in Kansas because that's where the lesser prairie chicken is, and the conservation efforts that KNRC hopes to promote, that's where those will be undertaken. So that's really ground zero for that conservation work.
And so then what happens? The Department of Justice or the Attorney General then has a certain period of time to respond, or does that kind of get accepted? I mean, what ends up being the process after you have filed those respective lawsuits?
So the next step will be the government will have to respond to both complaints in some way. That can be a sometimes slow process. The government has 60 days to respond, but often ask for more time. But the important takeaway is it is very easy for agencies to come into compliance with the Congressional Review Act. All it takes is to finally send their rules to Congress. So these are the types of cases that don't need to result in long, drawn-out litigation. If the agencies would just follow the law and submit their rules to democratic scrutiny, the cases could go away and the administration could do the right thing.
In the meantime, there's really not any consequence because, these bureaucrats are not following the law. But in the case of Pacific Legal, you're representing a client that it's a victim of this, right?
Yeah, and ultimately the consequence to the agency is exactly what Congress said in the Congressional Review Act. If you don't send the rule to Congress, it can't go into effect. So all of those things you were trying to accomplish with the rule, all of the enforcement actions that have been brought under the rule, they're all legally vulnerable and they can all be undone. And that is a serious consequence to the agency. That's why we're bringing these lawsuits now, to hold the agencies accountable.
Are you asking for some kind of a time frame? So in other words, if you've got these rules or these regulations and they don't comply within some window of time, then that rule or regulation just kind of falls on the floor and goes dark because they didn't comply with the law?
So the way our case will work is when we win, the court will order the agency to submit the rule to Congress as required. And that the court will only give the agency a reasonable amount of time to do that. It will not be a drawn-out process because I said it's really easy. They already have the rules. They've been published in the Federal Register. It literally takes a few minutes to print them out and send them over. So either whether the agency recognizes it's behaved illegally and starts sending the rules over now, or litigates this out and ultimately does so because a court forced it to, the ultimate result should happen pretty quickly.
So I'm going to be snotty here. Knowing that, pretty much every agency is, compelled to comply, and they don't, how come Congress doesn't, essentially subpoena or, say, funding goes into suspension, whatever kind of funding goes into suspension until these are delivered to us?
Well, that would require new legislation, as I'm sure you know. Getting anything passed through Congress is very difficult. That's why it's impressive the Congressional Review Act is the law of the land. Mm-hmm. But the Congressional Review Act has its own mechanism to ensure compliance. It's that when an agency doesn't follow the law, none of its rules go into effect. And so that's really the main mechanism by which agencies are punished for violating the law.
Well, these two cases you have, did I get this right, are against the Department of Interior? Is that right?
That's right. That's right. The sage-grouse one is against both the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture because they both adopted the sage-grouse land use plans. The other one is against the Department of Interior because it's responsible for implementing the Endangered Species Act.
But you're not necessarily pointing out the Department of Interior as being one of the worst of those agencies in non-compliance. It just happens to be that Pacific Legal is representing two clients of which, it touches the Department of Interior, correct?
Oh, that's right. These cases are about far more than just these two rules or just the Department of Interior. This is a problem that exists throughout the government, and that's why it's so essential that whether done by the courts or by the president, someone hold the agencies to account, and we start to go back and look at all of these rules that have been imposed on Americans illegally despite the fact they weren't submitted to Congress.
This is really kind of a new definition of bureaucracy, isn't it? Because, if it wasn't for somebody like Pacific Legal, I'm not completely convinced there would be a lot of compliance. So if, Pacific Legal forces Department of Interior rules to be submitted, would it be a chance that, those in Congress would say, who else, how many other rules within the Department of Interior, for instance, not necessarily isolating the Department of Interior, are in non-compliance? In other words, you've got a panel sitting there in some kind of a hearing. It says, do you have 2,000 or, 12,000 rules that we don't know about? Would something like that necessarily happen, Jonathan?
Perhaps. As a leading public interest law firm, PLF's mission is to establish the precedents that Americans across the country can rely upon. So when we win these two cases, we'll be setting the groundwork for other people to come along and challenge other rules that weren't submitted. We're at the front of the line, and there will be many people coming behind us to follow on the precedents we set in these two cases.
Is this the first time that a law firm has actually filed lawsuits for non-compliance to the Congressional Review Act?
I believe it's the first time that a concerted effort was made to challenge this issue in particular. The Congressional Review Act has come up in other litigation. Obviously, it's been around for more than 2 decades at this point, but PLF is leading the charge to reinvigorate that statute, vindicate its values of democratic accountability, and ensure that every agency follows the law.
Yeah, there was a little bit of activity on all of this last year, and then it just sort of faded away, so you're just relighting that fuse, right?
That's absolutely right. The Congress and the President did some great work pursuing deregulation last year, but the job's not done. There's still hundreds, perhaps thousands of rules that have never been scrutinized and need to before they can be enforced against anyone.
So you just filed these 2 lawsuits. Are you expecting some kind of response in 60 days or so?
So under the court rules, that would be when a response to lawsuits are due. But we'd be thrilled if the administration just did the right thing and sent the rules to Congress tomorrow. I'll let you speculate on whether you think that's likely to happen, but PLF is focused on getting the government to follow the law, and whether they do so voluntarily or only after we beat them in court, we'll do what it takes.
I like that attitude. You guys are like helping clean up some of this mess just by shining a spotlight on it. It's got to be somewhat frustrating that you're trying to help a client and all of a sudden you hit all these roadblocks, and then you got to do this, you got to go through A to H, in order to get something else handled to fulfill your client's needs. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, it is a job we are glad to do. Someday, perhaps liberty will be restored and the rule of law will be restored, and there won't be a need for us. But that day is not here, and we are glad to be on the front lines defending people's individual rights across the country.
I think you guys have a lot of career stability in this regard, just being a watchdog on if for nothing else, the Congressional Review Act or any of these other agencies. I think some of these agencies are trying to clean up their mess, but you almost have to kind of pick your target, because it's a target-rich environment on which mess is prioritized. And Pacific Legal, I think you've rung a bell here in if nothing else, 2 states. So you're to be congratulated on that. Is there a chance you're going to get some kind of a phone call from an agency bureaucrat that's going to say back off and go away, or do you expect this to kind of advance the way it needs to?
I doubt we'll get any phone calls like that. Either the government will do the right thing and send the rule to Congress, or it will fight us tooth and nail in the case. But given how clear the Congressional Review Act, I think that second strategy is a losing one, and I would look forward to the court vindicating the statute and the important rule of law principles at issue in the case.
You guys are great little watchdogs, and do very good work. The work that Pacific Legal does seems to, touch all kinds of topics and all kinds of bureaucratic nonsense, either at the state level or at the federal level. So I give you, Jonathan Wood, and your fellow lawyers a big hat tip, because it's rewarding to know that Pacific Legal is out there doing this kind of work, where otherwise we little guys, we would just kind of say, well, that's government. And so, thanks for sharing this. It's good to know that you're kind of sounding this horn again on the Congressional Review Act.
Well, thank you for those kind words, and thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us. There's more coming your way, so stay with us.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you this 24/7 stream of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. We are a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. If you're able, please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. Your donation will go a long way in helping us continue to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
This is Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience. When I'm not debating with Donna Fiducia about politics, I listen to Cowboy Logic Radio. Why, you ask? Because outside of my blog, founderscode.com, and my own radio show, the Denise Simon Experience, Cowboy Logic is by far the most entertaining and informative radio show on planet Earth. Plus, Don makes me feel guilty if I don't listen to his radio show every week.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
The Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Ladies and gentlemen, what the heck is that? Well, Rachel Bovard, our senior policy director from the Conservative Partnership Initiative, is here to tell us all about it. I think it's a cool thing. In fact, I think it's a great thing. Sadly, we would have to necessarily use something like this. Otherwise known as rescissions, but Rachel's going to break it down for us. She's been kind enough to be a victim here for Denise Simon Experience. So Rachel, thank you for being here and attempting to kind of explain all of this. We have
my pleasure.
We have this crazy omnibus thing that happened. And, it just blew people's mind with the kind of money that was in there and what was actually in it. And so now we're looking at something called rescission. And I'm thinking that the president has to request or propose Congress to go back and look at this omnibus and go, you better undo some things. So can it only be the initiative or the request of the president for this to happen, or can Congress do it on their own without that request?
Congress can do this on their own. And again, rescissions are essentially cuts to spending. They're repeal of existing budget authority. So money that's already been authorized to be spent, a rescission repeals that. And Congress can do this whenever it wants. However, it frequently does not because Congress likes to spend money, not necessarily to cut. But the president also has the authority to suggest cuts to Congress. He can, and that's reportedly what he's in the process of doing, is that he was so upset by the amount of spending in the recent $1.3 trillion omnibus that he's having his team put together a bunch of rescission proposals. And so they're basically spending cut proposals. And he can submit those to Congress, where Congress will introduce them as legislation. They have a fast-track process for getting it through the House and the Senate, and then if Congress passes them, they will go into effect, and we'll see cut spending. But Congress also has the option not to do anything, and so it's unclear which option they'll take. But it's not going to stop the president from making several proposals.
So this almost sounds like, somebody, a Mick Mulvaney or, the Congressional Budget Office or the Controller or the General Accounting Office or Treasury or somebody has necessarily got to go through the 1.3 trillion omnibus bill line by line, almost like a line item veto, if you will, and say, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this. So go, hey, Congress, these are the items prioritized or not, that you need to go back and redo. So some of this, I would say, could be subjective, correct?
That's right. They're really going to take a look at, not just spending that was passed in the omnibus, but likely spending across the government that they feel is wasteful, duplicative, or, outdated. And they're going to say to Congress, these are the areas that we would like you to cut. And Congress has done this before. Under Ronald Reagan, famously, he got billions of dollars in rescissions that Congress passed. So, this isn't as dramatic as I think a lot of people are making it out to be. It's been historically used several times. So yeah, he's going to suggest these cuts, and he's going to implore Congress to act, and it's going to put Congress in the position of having to say, no, if they don't want to do it, they can say, no, we would prefer to keep spending money, which is not a very good position for them to be in, particularly right before an election.
Well, yeah, coming into the midterms, I haven't heard too many in Congress even talking about rescission. Have you? I mean, in town halls or, on TV or anything else, I haven't heard many of them go, this is kind of outrageous, especially where some of what kind of money was in this omnibus. Are they missing an opportunity?
Yeah, I do think that they are. I don't think they expected Trump to take this position. I think these rescissions are a surprise to most people, but I also don't think that Trump expected Congress to pass a $1.3 trillion bill that no one had read. So, I think it's a correct and appropriate response from the president. And I do think Congress, this Congress has lost so much credibility on how much money they spent, how much they've driven up, the debt and the deficit, that Trump is giving them an opportunity to get a little bit of that credibility back by passing these targeted spending cuts. And I think they would be foolish to avoid it.
There are lots of outside organizations that watch this kind of stuff all the time. I would think the job would be really quite easy. We kind of miss the waste book that, used to be done. I think that Senator Coburn did it, and maybe somebody else kind of picked up that baton. But then you've got the organization against government waste. I mean, so I would say some of these items could be very easy to put in there where it actually equals billions or tens of billions or hundreds of billions. So would anybody in this Congressional Budget Office tap on private organizations to see what they, suggest?
I'm sure, those conversations are ongoing. I'm sure that the Mick Mulvaney staff at the Office of Management and Budget are having those conversations. A lot of those staffers used to work on Capitol Hill, so I do think that, they're familiar with those programs. I do think one of the difficulties they're having is the fact that the agencies know that these rescissions are coming and are now quickly trying to spend all their money before it gets cut. So you kind of have the bureaucracy working against Trump's efforts on this, which is disappointing.
Is this a long legislative? I mean, we've got a short window of time here, I think, just because they're trying to spend it pretty quickly. Is this a long process? I mean, does this require amendments, hearings, subcommittee hearings? I see this as being just as convoluted as, compiling 2,200, 2,300 pages in the first place.
So it does have an expedited process for getting through Congress that avoids some of those delay tactics that you're talking about, or things that would delay it. It has to. So when the president sends it to Congress, Congress will introduce his proposal as a bill, and then it is referred to committee. However, if the committees don't act on it, it is automatically sent to the floor within 25 days. Wow. So they can spend 25 days in committee, but no more than that. And then once it's on the floor, there can be amendments. In the Senate, it's subject to what's called a vote-a-rama process, which is a lot of amendments.
Vote-a-rama.
The debate time is limited to 10 hours, as opposed to, the unlimited debate that most bills have. So it is a quicker process. It's not subject to the 60-vote threshold in the Senate, which is another added perk of using this process. So if the alternative is that Congress can do nothing, right? It will come to the floor. Congress simply will not take it up. That's always an option. But if they do choose to do something, they can do it for this particular bill a lot faster than they could for other legislation.
Well, for the Republicans, those in the Freedom Caucus and what, it would certainly work to their benefit to be on TV right now talking about all of this. I would say, is there some target number, Rachel, that we want to get to? I mean, do we want to take out $700 billion? I mean, is that some kind of a target number? We end up settling for $300 billion? I mean, what is that in order to make this thing look a little better?
Yeah, well, that's up to the president, to be honest, how much he wants to ask for. It's up to Congress to determine how much they'll give him. I suspect that we'll see a proposal from the White House, and that's anywhere from $10 billion to $20 billion. I think that they are looking at what is possible to get through Congress. And so just based on some conversations I've had with White House staff, I think that's where they're at. But, until we actually see what comes out of the White House, it's difficult to know for sure.
There's got to be some target items. And I would say, based on some things that we found when reading through the 2,200 plus pages, when it came to sanctuary cities and Planned Parenthood and, Obamacare bailouts and climate change, those kinds of things. Any of those that will be part of a bigger argument like Planned Parenthood?
I would hope that is the case. I would hope that the White House produces a rescissions package that targets, some of the Planned Parenthood money. It won't be able to target all of it, but it just because of the way the budget is structured, but it will be able to get at some of it. Again, this is a promise that Republicans have made to voters for decades. Put us into power and we will, eliminate federal funding for Planned Parenthood. The fact that we have now had a majority, congressional majorities across the government for this long and we haven't acted on this is appalling, I think, to a lot of people. So I would hope that the rescissions package does take on some of these issues like funding for Planned Parenthood and sanctuary cities, and issues that are really important to voters.
Can this also, I mean, we're talking about, cutting some of this spending, and that's a good thing. But what about things like grants and loan guarantees? I mean, is that part of all of this too? Because I don't think we ought to be in the loan guarantee business, but that's just Denise. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think they'll be able to get at some of those, should they choose. And I do think it's a problem across the government that we the taxpayers backstop a lot of, otherwise very risky ventures that are funded by the government. And that's, I think a lot of conservatives feel like you do, which is that this is not an appropriate role for the government. Specifically in risky industries, this financing should be sought privately. That's what the private market is for. The government doesn't need to be involved in this kind of thing.
Indeed. So, can this Impoundment Control Act, Rachel, also shift money? Not just stop it, but say we need to have this money, but we're going to take it away from here and we're going to put it over there. I mean, can that also be included in this whole rescission operation?
Unfortunately not.
Not a good answer.
Yeah, just limited to spending cuts. Congress has the ability to move money around wherever it wants, but the president is constitutionally restricted from having that much discretion over money because Congress has the power of the purse. It's pretty much subject to their discretion as opposed to what in terms of where they want to put money.
Okay, so he couldn't even suggest it or recommend it.
Nope, not under this process.
Oh, not a good answer. Okay, well, we've identified things like Planned Parenthood and Obamacare bailouts and, climate change stupidness and whatnot. But I would argue there's probably thousands and thousands of smaller items in there that nobody pays a lot of attention to because the price tag on them is not all big. You got $1 billion over here for this or, $2 million for that and $6 million for this, and I would say that you could probably come up with thousands of smaller things that are, just in the tens of millions of dollars that probably otherwise wouldn't get a lot of attention, but you can quickly add those things up to come out to tens of billions, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's what the president's going to try to focus on, which is get at these little areas of waste so they amount to something significant in savings.
Do agencies have any kind of say-so in any of this process that, like, gee, thanks for this money, but we don't need this and we don't need that? Not that they would, but I mean, you might have a legitimate person that...
Well, interestingly, that's what Mick Mulvaney did when he took over the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He gave a lot of that money back to Congress. He said, this agency doesn't need this. I think to my knowledge, that may be the only time that's ever happened.
Well, if you look at like the Department of Education, and you really do a deep dive in there, there's stuff in there that is just really kind of outrageous. If you look at Health and Human Services, why in the world are we wanting to fund women's health care in third world countries? Isn't that what the UN's supposed to do?
No, I think that's exactly right. And you find that across the government. You find, international conservation programs at the Department of Education or at the Department of Energy completely, out of touch with what the agency's mission is intended. And I do think those are rife areas for cuts. I think a lot of people are frustrated that the omnibus did not contain money for border security in the United States, but contained money for border security in the Middle East. Things like that, I think, are areas that the president could target for rescission.
We don't have anybody at the State Department yet, and the State Department is obviously in some kind of chaos. I'm not even sure we have a real handle on that kind of spending over there, that goes offshore, that leaves our continent and goes elsewhere. And I don't know that anybody is in the position to target those kinds of dollars, especially under USAID or the Millennium Challenge or the Meredith Initiative or, some of these other cockamamie things. And I would say we probably don't have a handle on that kind of spending at all, do we?
I think those are really good areas to look at. I think Congress deals with spending in those areas in its foreign aid appropriations bill, but the Senate hasn't considered one of those in a long time. Instead, they shove it all into one giant omnibus and don't let anyone have amendments. And so, no, there is no way for Congress to control spending or for specific members to have a say in how much those programs get when a bill is considered like this omnibus was, with no amendments, no warning, no one even read it. That is not good for fiscal oversight. That is not good for fiscal responsibility. And if people really want to get a handle on what's being spent where, they need time. They need time to look at it, and they need an opportunity to amend it. Otherwise, what's the point of it even being there?
So I'm going to kind of circle back around to process. Is there some kind of a window of time here that this White House has such that they are going to get these recommendations back over to Congress? I mean, something tells me that we could be in November, December, or January before this process is in full bore traction and gets resolved. I'm a little fretful on it.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. I mean, the clock will start when the White House makes their proposal, and I know that they're actively working on it now. So, hopefully it's something we'll see in the next couple of weeks.
Something like Export-Import Bank, where are we with that one?
So as far as I know, they still operate at a quorum where they cannot approve loans over $10 million. So that's one area where conservatives have been pretty successful. They've shut down a lot of that bank's ability to make these billion-dollar loans to companies like Boeing and Caterpillar. But it's still functional, so it's still a target, but it is much more restrained as long as members do not continue to be appointed to the board.
Rachel, in your travels on the Hill and at the White House, what specifically are you hearing that might be on the short list to be part of these rescissions?
So I do think that they're taking a serious look at some of these programmatic elements that you were mentioning, so grant programs, kind of funding for research that basically amounts to shrimps on a treadmill. Particularly areas that the president was unhappy with in the omnibus, he's going to target those. And a lot of that has to do with border security. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of areas like that.
But then again, are we doing this because we need to look at, is there kind of an alternate, motive here, such that we need to redirect money, take it away from over here because we've got to save some dollars for some kind of an infrastructure plan?
I think right now the president is really just focused on trying to kind of get Congress to do a do-over after that $1.3 trillion bill. I don't think he's thinking, so much about shifting funds for one priority or another. I think he just is focused on the fact that they never should have passed a bill that size in the first place. And so I think he wants to make a point about restraining the growth of government in that regard.
I haven't heard the Freedom Caucus talk about most of this, and yet they have been one of the more outspoken caucuses in the House talking about this omnibus bill. I'm sure they have their own little list that they would like to include. This is being handed to them all on a silver platter here. Do we have members of Congress that have their own little list that they'd like to re-examine?
I think a lot of members of Congress have those lists, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were sharing them directly with the White House, for potential areas of rescission. So I would look for that.
So we're just dialing for dollars everywhere, aren't we?
Pretty much. That's pretty much what I'm doing.
We've got UN dues, we've got foreign aid, we've got, social programs like, education, we've got upgrades we need to do. There's an awful lot of things that have to be cleaned up. I didn't see a lot of the omnibus bill address some real key things. They just where does this money, let me ask you this question. We're going to assign $700 million to some kind of a, climate change thing. Who comes up? Where does the $700 million come from when the cost could maybe only be $110 million? It's kind of like they just throw some number here. Is there some factual thing, or we just kind of, carry stuff over year after year after year under, continuing resolutions and whatnot?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above in terms of how they determine these funding levels. All of them are determined by the Appropriations Committee in the Congress, and they'll take input from the regulating agencies that say, if you want us to do X, so if you want us to create a climate change body, we think we'll need this much money to do it. There are also political considerations, obviously, if that climate change company or board is going to be located in a certain member's district, maybe that member wants more money for it. Mm-hmm. Things like that all go into it, but it's primarily the Appropriations Committee that has control over that with input from the agencies. But a lot of it is, policy, politics, everything goes into making that decision. But there's a reason that the appropriations members are called cardinals. That's because they're very powerful. They get to decide all of that money, where it goes and how much.
All right, here's another $64,000 question before I let you go. Where is the whole lobby operation? The A, B, C, D, and E, and K, and L Street operations with this rescission thing?
K Street and the lobbyists there historically don't like rescissions. Right. They don't like programs being cut. They don't, they prefer that these things keep going. A lot of these are probably, areas that these lobbyists have clients whose programs will be cut. So they are not keen on the process, to put it mildly.
Yeah. Especially when there's, I would say there were some dollars attached, like don't do line item 168, and in order for you not to do that, here's a check for $10,000, right?
I mean, I've heard of that happening.
Well, you sound optimistic on this process. I'm going to trust that. Are you optimistic?
I mean, I'm not completely optimistic. I do think that Congress, a lot of people in Congress are so opposed to this that it'll be difficult to get consensus on it. But I do think that if there are people, members of Congress who do care about spending, who are upset with the amount of money they passed, they can use this process to their advantage. So I'm excited to see this president take this step. I think it's important. And I hope there are people in Congress that step up and support it.
Do we have somebody other than Mick Mulvaney that might be driving this for the White House?
I mean, as far as I can tell, the president himself is very engaged in this process.
Okay.
This is a priority for him, so that's always a good sign.
All right, and then of course it gets convoluted with the the trade deals that we're working on, and the political season and whatnot. So there's a lot of interference that could be in this process, right?
Of course, as always, it is DC after all. The swamp is everywhere.
Well, I'm real happy to have this conversation with you because, I mean, there is some hope to this, and it has been used before. I like the word impoundment better than rescission because I'm not sure a lot of us necessarily understand rescission, but we do understand impound. And historically, it has been done. And I think with Speaker Ryan, 1 foot out the door and heading back to Wisconsin here, he may be of some help. He's the numbers guru, so I think he may be of some help on the way out the door, especially from a fundraising point of view. Did I get that right or wrong?
No, I think that's right. Paul Ryan for a long time has been the numbers guy for the Republican conference, so I do think he'll be interested in making this work.
Rachel Bovard, Senior Policy Director at the Conservative Partnership Initiative. I'm very happy to have this conversation because it shows that there are some tools that we little people out here otherwise didn't necessarily know about, and it gets lost, and if for nothing else, it gets kind of stuck in darkness with all the other stupidness that goes on in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, if we can cut $60 billion, that's a step in the right direction. So, thanks for your insight and telling us how it works, and we appreciate your efforts.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience, and we'll see you again very soon.